Technology marches on. In fact, it marches on at such a brisk pace, we tend to forget that way back in the first generation of 3D consoles, the main competitors were quite a bit different from each other. If you've ever wondered why we don't see so many Nintendo 64 or Sega Saturn games in virtual stores, the reason for this is actually that the tech to make these games run is occasionally a little tricky to emulate on modern consoles and modern computers. So this video takes a look at the graphic quirks in the first PlayStation, the N64, and the Sega Saturn, and we'll just skip the CDI, 3DO, and Jaguar since the CDI didn't have any 3D games anyway, and no one really cares about the other two. So let's get on with it. The PlayStation, twitchy textures. Now let's begin with the PlayStation since it was the most successful console of the lot, and also because every one of you who's ever played a PS1 game knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you've played any 3D game on the system at all, you will have seen it. The PlayStation was technologically pretty good, but every single game on the PS1, which used polygonal graphics, always seems to have that one stray polygon that begins twitching at odd and strange times. So, what causes this twitching or dancing polygon phenomenon? Well, even though the PlayStation was released between 1994 and 1995 globally, people need to remember that the console's development started already in the late 80s. And even though the final product was very different from those early prototypes, it does seem Sony never got around to upgrading the rendering algorithm, and because of this, the PlayStation occasionally has to guess where the certain polygon has to go. That's the simple explanation. The long version involves a bunch of math, but basically it boils down to one part of the PlayStation's design not being able to keep up with the game designers who were trying to make their game worlds as unblocky as possible. Now, it's clear that this twitchy pixel business didn't hurt the PlayStation's sales, but it is a cute little signature of the console's imperfections. I mean, it's cute compared to the game load times. Ugh. Nintendo 64 Fog. Alright, so everyone knows about the PlayStation's twitchy pixels, but even if you've never owned a Nintendo 64, you've no doubt heard about this graphic quirk as well. Now, it's no secret, the N64 was easily the most technically superior system of the three we're going to discuss, but the graphic quirk which it suffered from, and which surprisingly many game publications wrote about, seemed to come about over nothing more than simple oversight. Now, you've probably noticed this yourself if you've ever looked in the distance in any Nintendo 64 game. While the N64 had way better draw distance than the PlayStation, you will no doubt notice how items in the distance always appear a little blurry or colorless until you walk right up to them. This is the infamous N64 fog effect. So, what causes this? Now, at least in the old days, all the early 3D consoles had something called a bit cache. And what this was basically just a chunk of the console's memory, which was dedicated to all the textures which are needed to cover up all those polygons, so they don't just end up looking like solid, colorless shapes. Unfortunately, Nintendo's engineers seem to have forgotten to take the rendering power of the system into account, and as a result, the N64's bit cache is simply too small. Now, this wasn't a big deal for colorful games like Super Mario 64, but already in games like Ocarina of Time, you'll often notice how stretched a lot of the textures are, because otherwise the N64 wouldn't be able to render them, or they would have had to have taken out other textures altogether. And this is also why objects in the distance appear foggy, because the textures for them haven't loaded yet, because otherwise something else near you wouldn't have any textures either. Now, some smart game designers did find ways around this problem. For instance, if you've ever wondered why there's a big freaking hill in the middle of Hyrule Field in Ocarina of Time, it's there just so the game world wouldn't look like a barren, spooky ghostscape. Similar tactics were employed by other designers, but then in some games, like GoldenEye, the stretching of those textures is just flatly obvious. Saturn square polygons. And finally, we come to the runt of the litter. Because the Saturn was such an unmitigated disaster as a console release, this next particular quirk isn't perhaps as well known about. Now, the Saturn is notoriously difficult to emulate, and part of the problem is that Sega has actually misplaced a lot of the data and design documents for the system. Whoops! But that's just part of the problem. The Saturn's tech is also a real clusterfuck, and a weird, seemingly arbitrary problem was created for seemingly no other reason than to make the Saturn appear different from the other 3D consoles. Now, let's talk about polygons and what they actually are. Polygons are the three-dimensional shapes that make up everything in a game. In early 3D games, you could only have a little under 100 of them for any given object without making the game lag uncontrollably. While these days it's not uncommon to have anywhere in the neighborhood of 1,000,000 of them for any one object or character in a game engine. Though of course common sense applies and sometimes too much is just too much. More importantly, polygons in 99% of all 3D consoles have always been triangles. In other words, if you want to create a square using triangles, you have to use 2 polygons. The Saturn being the exception, since it's the only console, as far as I'm aware of, which actually uses square polygons. The reasoning for this isn't entirely clear to me either. Maybe this was a relic of Sega's 3D arcade technology, or maybe they just didn't want to do the same thing as everyone else. So are there any advantages to using square rather than triangular polygons? Well, making box shapes definitely requires less from the graphics processor, but it seems like a weird direction to take since creating stuff like Sonic Spikes admittedly would have been easier with triangular rather than rectangular polygons. Plus, most 3D engines use triangular polygons specifically because they're the simplest shape and easy to manipulate. Now, I'm not saying square polygons are solely to blame for why Saturn games don't appear more in virtual stores, but they definitely don't help. Well, I hope you found that interesting. What other graphic quirks do you like about old video games? Leave them in the comments below. I'm Hannu the Hande Mäkinen. See you on the next one.